Silence hangs thick in the Sistine Chapel, a heavy cloak of anticipation and political tension. Behind those sacred walls, the fate of millions rested on the secret votes of a few men, a process that should have been divine but was often brutally human. This is the story of 35 of the most dramatic, controversial, and downright shocking papal elections in history. You are about to witness a centuries-long saga where spiritual destiny collided with raw ambition, a world of bribery, imprisonment, and even murder. By the end of this journey, you will understand how the quest for ultimate power reshaped the very soul of Western civilization. How could a corpse be put on trial by the very man who replaced it, and what drove a mob to tear the roof off a church to force a decision? When you think about absolute power, what do you believe is its ultimate cost? The year was 897, and the papal throne was a prize fought over by warring Roman families. Into this cauldron of hatred stepped Stephen VI, a man consumed by a terrifying vendetta. His rage was not directed at a living rival, but at a dead man, his predecessor, Pope Formosus. To solidify his own illegitimate power, Stephen orchestrated an event so grotesque it would echo through history with a chilling name, the Cadaver Synod. He ordered the corpse of Formosus to be exhumed from its tomb. The decomposing body was then dressed in full papal vestments and propped up on a throne in the Lateran Basilica. A deacon was appointed to speak for the silent defendant as Stephen, acting as both prosecutor and judge, screamed accusations at the rotting corpse. The charges were a mockery of justice, centered on Formosus breaking an old church law by leaving his original diocese to become the Bishop of Rome. Can you conceive of a more profound disrespect, a more complete inversion of sacred duty into personal vengeance? The dead pope was unsurprisingly found guilty. The sentence was carried out with brutal finality. The 3 fingers used by Formosus for blessings were chopped from his right hand, his papal vestments were torn from his body, and his remains were dragged through the streets of Rome before being thrown into the Tiber River. This was not merely a political murder after the fact. It was a calculated act of terror designed to humiliate an enemy beyond the grave and terrify any living soul who might oppose Stephen's rule. He had put the very institution of the papacy itself on trial and found it guilty. What kind of fear, what kind of twisted world creates a spectacle where a corpse must answer for its sins? But the terror of the Cadaver Synod could not last. Stephen VI himself was soon imprisoned and strangled, his brutal reign ending as violently as it began. Yet the chaos he embodied only deepened, festering in the heart of Rome for decades. Then, in 904, a new and even more insidious power seized control of the papacy, plunging it into an era so dark it would be called the Saeculum Obscurum. This was the beginning of the pornocracy, the rule of the harlots, and it started with the violent election of Pope Sergius III. Sergius did not win his throne through prayer or piety. He seized it with the backing of a Roman warlord and by having his rival, Pope Leo V, imprisoned and murdered. His pontificate marked a fundamental shift. The papacy was no longer just a spiritual office contested by feuding families. It became the personal property of one dynasty, the House of Theophylact. And the true power behind the throne was not the Pope, but a remarkable and ruthless woman, Marozia. As the daughter of the powerful Theophylact I and his wife Theodora, Marozia was raised in the heart of Roman politics. She was reportedly the lover of Pope Sergius III, and through a combination of strategic marriages, military alliances, and sheer political cunning, she orchestrated the elections of at least 4 popes over 3 decades. One of those popes was widely believed to be her own son, a direct product of her relationship with Sergius. Can you grasp the sheer scale of this control? For generations, the spiritual leader of Western Christendom was effectively chosen by a single family, turning St. Peter's chair into a hereditary prize. Imagine the whispers in the streets of Rome, the open secret that the Vicar of Christ answered to a powerful matriarch. This was not a sudden coup, but a slow, systemic takeover that made the papacy a family business. The pornocracy was more than just a series of scandals. It represented the complete fusion of raw secular power with sacred authority, creating a shadow government that operated from behind the papal throne. The cost of this corruption was a church stripped of its moral authority, its leadership bought and sold like a commodity. What does it do to the faith of millions when the very source of spiritual guidance is controlled by a single, unaccountable family? Marozia's dynasty did not end with her. The iron grip her family held on the papacy was simply passed down, a corrupt inheritance that poisoned the next century. By 1012, her descendants, now known as the Tusculani family, had perfected the art of control. They no longer needed to manipulate from the shadows. They simply installed their own patriarch, Theophylact II, as Pope Benedict VIII. His election was not a sacred conclave but a family decree. Imagine a world where the leadership of a global faith was treated like a piece of private property, handed from one relative to the next with all the ceremony of a land deed. Benedict VIII was a Tusculan puppet, a man whose primary loyalty was to his family's wealth and power, not to the spiritual needs of the church. His reign, while politically successful in some military ventures, was a stark symbol of how deeply the rot had set in. The papacy had become a hereditary title, a prize for the most powerful Roman clan. What happens to an institution when its leaders are chosen for their bloodline rather than their devotion? The spiritual authority of the Pope crumbled, becoming a hollow echo in the face of such blatant nepotism. This was not an isolated incident but a pattern, leading directly to a series of puppet popes who served at the pleasure of the Tusculani. The very office meant to guide souls was now a tool for earthly domination, its power so diminished that it could barely whisper against the families who controlled it. How far must an institution fall before it can no longer recognize its own purpose? By the year 1046, the papacy had hit its lowest point. The throne of St. Peter was not just corrupted, it was fractured. 3 different men all claimed the title of Pope at the same time, a chaotic triangle of power that brought the Church to its knees. One of these claimants was Pope Benedict IX, a man from the Tusculani family who had reportedly sold the papacy to his godfather, who became Gregory VI. Meanwhile, a third faction in Rome had installed their own candidate, Sylvester III. The spiritual center of the Christian world was now a 3-way battleground, with each pope excommunicating the others and the faithful utterly bewildered. How could anyone know who held true authority when the very office was split into warring pieces? This was more than a political crisis. It was a complete collapse of order that threatened to tear the Church apart from within. Into this unprecedented chaos rode a secular ruler with the power and will to impose a solution, Holy Roman Emperor Henry III. He was a devout man, horrified by the spectacle before him, and he summoned a council to the town of Sutri to settle the matter once and for all. The Synod of Sutri was not a gentle debate. It was a judicial proceeding where Emperor Henry acted as judge. One by one, the 3 rival popes were called to account. Benedict IX was charged with simony, the buying and selling of church offices. Gregory VI, despite his initial good intentions, was forced to admit he had gained the office through a financial transaction. Sylvester III was accused of usurping power. The council, under the emperor's firm guidance, found all 3 men unfit and deposed them. In a single, stunning act, the papacy was declared vacant. But Henry III did not stop there. To ensure a clean and legitimate succession, he used his imperial authority to appoint his own candidate, a German bishop who became Pope Clement II. This was the ultimate expression of imperial interference. The spiritual leader of the Catholic Church was now directly chosen by a temporal ruler. The emperor had not just cleaned house, he had built a new one and handed it to a pope of his own making. What does it mean when the only solution to a deep spiritual crisis is the heavy hand of a king? The Synod of Sutri rescued the papacy from total disintegration, but it did so at a tremendous cost, binding the Church's future even tighter to the whims of empire and setting the stage for an even greater conflict. The emperor's solution at Sutri had saved the papacy from collapse, but it forged chains of dependence. For decades, German emperors continued to appoint popes, treating the spiritual office as an extension of their own imperial authority. This system, however, could not withstand a rising tide of outrage from within the Church itself. A powerful movement of reformers centered in a monastery at Cluny began to demand a purification of the entire clergy. Their central goal was to shatter the very practice that had allowed emperors to control the Church, a sin they called lay investiture. This was the moment the Church decided to fight back, and the election of 1061 would become its first major battlefield. The reformers wanted a pope free from imperial control, a spiritual leader chosen by the Church for the Church. When the old pope died, this powerful faction acted swiftly, seizing the initiative to elect their candidate, a devout and reform-minded bishop who took the name Alexander II. His election in Rome was a direct challenge to imperial power, a declaration of independence that the German court could not ignore. In response, the young German king, Henry IV, and his regents assembled a council of loyal bishops. They declared Alexander's election invalid and nominated their own pope, the Bishop of Parma, who became the antipope Honorius II. For the first time, the conflict was not between rival Roman families, but between two competing visions of authority. On one side stood a pope elected by the Church, championing spiritual renewal. On the other stood an antipope appointed by an emperor, representing the old order of control. Can you envision the sheer tension of this divided world, where two men each claimed to be the sole vicar of Christ? The schism was not resolved through debate or theology, but by the sword. Alexander II's supporters, including powerful Norman allies in southern Italy, marched on Rome and defeated the forces backing Honorius. Military force decided who was the true pope. This was a pivotal victory for the reformers, but it set a dangerous precedent. The struggle for the soul of the papacy was no longer confined to whispered conspiracies in dark chapels. It was now an open war, and the battlefield was all of Europe. If the Church had to raise an army to defend its right to choose its own leader, what did that say about the nature of its power? The fight had only just begun, and the next confrontation would be even more explosive. The victory of the reformers was a fragile one, and the deep-seated rivalries of Rome's noble families were not so easily erased. Just 7 decades after the clash with the emperor, the ancient feud between the Frangipani and the Pierleoni families erupted into a new schism that would tear the Church in two. The year was 1130, and the death of Pope Honorius II created a power vacuum both families were desperate to fill. In the chaotic hours following the Pope's death, a small but powerful faction of cardinals, backed by the Frangipani family, hastily elected a cardinal named Gregorio Papersky, who became Pope Innocent II. But this was no unanimous decision. The majority of cardinals loyal to the rival Pierleoni clan saw this as a brazen theft of the papal throne. They convened their own conclave and elected their candidate, Cardinal Pietro Pierleoni, who took the name Anacletus II. For the second time in living memory, two men claimed to be the one true pope. The conflict, however, was not merely about political power. It was poisoned by a deeply personal and prejudiced smear campaign waged against Anacletus. His family, the powerful Pierleoni, were wealthy bankers who had converted from Judaism to Christianity generations earlier. In the ruthless politics of medieval Rome, this became the ultimate weapon. Innocent supporters did not attack Anacletus's policies or his piety. Instead, they whispered and then shouted about his bloodline. They labeled him the Jewish Pope, using his family's origins to question the very legitimacy of his faith and his fitness to lead the Christian world. Can you grasp the cruelty of this tactic? In an age of intense religious fervor, his opponents claimed that the blood of Christendom's ancient rivals now sat upon the throne of St. Peter. This was not a theological debate. It was a calculated appeal to bigotry designed to turn the faithful against him, and for a time it worked brilliantly. Anacletus held Rome itself, his family's wealth and influence securing the city. But Innocent II, branded as the pure and legitimate candidate, fled north to France. There he won the support of the most powerful religious figures of the age, including the immensely influential Bernard of Clairvaux. Saint Bernard used his considerable moral authority to lobby kings and bishops across Europe, tirelessly arguing that the noble-born Innocent was the true pope, while portraying Anacletus as an impostor whose faith was inherently suspect. The spiritual weight of Europe slowly tilted against the Pope in Rome. For 8 long years, the schism endured, a protracted war of propaganda and political pressure where faith was used as a cudgel. Anacletus died in 1138, still holding power in Rome but largely isolated from the wider Christian world. His successor as antipope quickly surrendered, and Innocent II finally marched into Rome as its uncontested pontiff. The schism of Anacletus II reveals a painful truth. Even after the reforms meant to purify papal elections, the process could still be hijacked by ancient hatreds and social prejudices. The charge of being a Jewish pope was a lie, but it was a powerful one that resonated in a world not yet ready to separate a man's spiritual worth from his family's distant past. The throne of St. Peter was supposed to be a seat of universal faith, but in the hands of its contenders it became a weapon for exclusion. How many other voices, how many other potential leaders were silenced by such poisonous whispers throughout history? The drama of this election proved that the most dangerous threats to the papacy were not always armies at the gates, but the prejudices that could so easily fester within the human heart. The bitter schism over Anacletus II was a wound that had barely healed when the cardinals gathered again in 1159. This time, the struggle was not between Roman families, but over a question that would define the medieval world itself. Who held ultimate authority, the Pope or the Emperor? The conclave to elect a new Pope exploded into violence almost immediately. 2 clear factions emerged. One, a powerful group of imperialists supported by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, wanted a pope who would bow to imperial will. The other, a coalition of reformers and cardinals determined to protect the Church's independence, sought a leader of equal strength. When the reformist candidate, Cardinal Orlando Bandinelli, was elected and took the name Alexander III, the imperialists refused to accept the result. They claimed the election was invalid and, in a scene of pure chaos, physically attacked Cardinal Bandinelli right there in the basilica. His own supporters had to form a human shield to protect him from the blows of his enraged colleagues. Can you picture the sacred space of St. Peter's transformed into a brawling mob, with the newly chosen pope fleeing for his life? The imperial faction did not stop there. With the emperor's backing, they proclaimed their own candidate, Cardinal Octavian of Monticelli, as Pope Victor IV, and so began an 18-year schism, a relentless war of legitimacy that would see not 1, but 4 successive antipopes raised by the imperial court to challenge Alexander. For nearly 2 decades, Alexander III was forced to rule from outside Rome, a pope in exile, while Emperor Frederick Barbarossa marched his armies into Italy to install his own puppet pontiffs. This was not a single disputed election, it was a perpetual state of conflict. The emperor would depose one antipope only to replace him with another the moment it suited his political needs, creating a shadow papacy that existed solely to serve imperial ambition. What does it take to hold onto your faith when empires and armies are arrayed against you? Alexander's ultimate victory was not won on the battlefield, though his allies did have military successes. It was won through sheer, unyielding endurance and brilliant diplomacy. He outlasted the emperors and popes, and most importantly, he outlived the emperor's patience. Frederick Barbarossa was finally forced to recognize Alexander as the one true pope, kneeling before him in a dramatic act of submission in 1177. The 18-year schism ended with the principle of papal independence not just intact but stronger than ever. The Pope had weathered the storm of imperial power, but the cost was a generation of division. How many souls were left confused, their spiritual loyalties torn between two rival claimants for nearly 20 years? This election proved that the papacy could survive direct imperial assault, but it also revealed that its authority was a fragile idea, one that had to be defended not only with faith but with political cunning and an iron will. Alexander III's hard-won authority had finally secured the papacy's independence, but that very prize only made the next election a more desperate scramble for power. In 1191, just over a decade after the Great Schism ended, the cardinals found themselves locked in a bitter stalemate. They could not agree on a candidate, with rival factions each vetoing the other's choices, threatening to plunge the Church back into the chaos it had just escaped. Their ultimate solution was not to elect a strong leader, but to choose the one man they believed could not threaten any of them, an 85-year-old cardinal named Jacinto Barbone. He took the name Pope Celestine III. Think about the logic of that choice. In a desperate bid for peace, they selected a pontiff whose greatest qualification was his imminent mortality. He was not elected for his vision or his vigor, but for his weakness. He was a compromise, a temporary placeholder meant to hold the throne warm while the real powers decided on a more permanent successor. Can you imagine the quiet humiliation of such a position, knowing you were chosen precisely because you were not expected to last or to lead? The powerful Roman families, particularly the Orsini, to whom Celestine was connected by blood, saw not a spiritual father but a perfect puppet. His advanced age and gentle disposition made him seem pliable, a figurehead who would not interfere with their own ambitions. For the brief 7 years of his pontificate, that is largely what he became. He was constantly pressured and manipulated, his decisions swayed by the very factions that had elected him as a neutral party. The tragedy of Celestine III was not one of malice but of irrelevance. He was a living monument to a political deal, a reminder that even after the great battles for papal freedom, the throne could still be occupied by a man who held little real power. What is the true cost of a compromise that sacrifices strength for the mere illusion of stability? His reign proved that a pope who was chosen to be weak could not help but be weak, leaving the Church adrift just when it needed a steady hand to guide its hard-won independence. The compromise of Celestine III had left the papacy drifting, a rudderless ship in a sea of European politics. His death in 1198 created a vacuum, and the cardinals who gathered were determined not to repeat their mistake. They would not choose another placeholder. This time they sought a leader of true substance, and in a stunning turn, their gaze fell upon a 37-year-old cardinal who was not even present for the vote, a man named Lotario de Conti di Segni. His youth was not an asset, it was a potential liability in a world that revered age and experience. Yet the cardinals, weary of weakness and factional infighting, saw in him a brilliant mind and an unshakable resolve. They elected him unanimously, and he took the name Pope Innocent III. Can you conceive of the shockwaves this sent through the courts of Europe? A young, untested pope now held the throne of St. Peter, and no one could have predicted the titanic force he would become. Innocent III did not merely occupy the papal office, he redefined its very essence. He articulated a radical vision of papal power, declaring that the Pope was the vicar of Christ, standing between God and man, and therefore held authority over all earthly rulers. He was the sun, he proclaimed, and kings were merely the moon, reflecting his borrowed light. This was not just lofty theology, it was a political manifesto. He immediately set about making it a reality, intervening in the succession disputes of the Holy Roman Empire with the skill of a master strategist. He excommunicated powerful kings and forced them to kneel in submission. He sanctioned vast military campaigns like the Albigensian Crusade in southern France to enforce religious orthodoxy with the sword. Under his command, the Fourth Crusade was launched, though it would infamously veer off course to sack the Christian city of Constantinople. Every action was a calculated move to demonstrate that no monarch in Europe could claim true sovereignty without the Pope's blessing. He turned the papacy into the supreme court of Christendom, the final arbiter in all matters, spiritual and temporal. How could one man, and a young one at that, amass such unprecedented power so quickly? His election proved that a single determined will could transform an institution from within, bending the course of history to its vision. The compromise candidate was forgotten, replaced by a pope who believed his authority was second only to God's. What does it mean when spiritual power decides it must also rule the earthly realm? Innocent III had forged a papacy of immense power, but that power became a curse for the men who followed him. The very authority he centralized made every subsequent election a high-stakes war, a struggle so intense that it could paralyze the entire church. For nearly 3 years after the death of Pope Clement IV in 1268, the throne of St. Peter stood empty. The cardinals were hopelessly deadlocked in the Italian town of Viterbo, trapped by their own political alliances and regional rivalries. They argued and schemed for 33 long months while the Christian world waited, leaderless and adrift. How could the spiritual heart of Europe simply stop beating for so long? The people of Viterbo watched this spectacle of indecision with growing fury. To them, this was not a sacred process. It was a selfish political game played by privileged men while their souls suffered. Their patience finally snapped. A crowd of citizens, led by the city's captain, stormed the episcopal palace where the cardinals were deliberating. They did not attack the cardinals themselves. Instead, they took a more dramatic and symbolic action. They tore the roof right off the building. They literally unroofed the palace, exposing the princes of the church to the open sky and the elements. Their message was brutally clear. There would be no comfort, no privacy, and no escape until their duty was done. But they did not stop with architectural sabotage. The city officials then placed the cardinals under a strict diet of bread and water, stripping away all luxuries to force a decision through sheer deprivation. Can you envision the scene? These powerful men huddled under the open air, eating meager rations, their every move watched by an angry populace below. The pressure worked. Within a matter of days, the deadlock broke. The cardinals swiftly compromised on a candidate who was not even among them, a pious archdeacon named Teobaldo Visconti, who was on a crusade in the Holy Land at the time. He returned to become Pope Gregory X. The desperate measures of the Viterbans had worked, but the near collapse of the entire process horrified the new pope. He knew such chaos could not be allowed to happen again. At the Great Council of Lyon in 1274, he enacted a groundbreaking law that would shape papal elections for centuries, the Constitution Ubi Periculum. This decree established the formal conclave. It mandated that after a pope's death, the cardinals must be locked in together, in seclusion within 10 days. Their food would be progressively reduced if they failed to reach a decision quickly, directly mirroring the bread and water diet he had personally experienced. The dramatic intervention of a frustrated mob, born from a 3-year vacancy, had created the very rules designed to prevent their actions from ever being necessary again. What does it say about an institution that it requires the threat of a torn-off roof to fulfill its most basic function? The conclave was born not from serene planning, but from the raw, impatient will of the people it was meant to serve. The rules of the conclave, forged from the chaos of a torn-off roof, were meant to impose order, but they could not legislate against human weakness. Just 2 decades after Gregory X's reforms, the cardinals gathered in the city of Perugia found themselves in a deadlock so profound it seemed to mock the very institution they served. For 27 months they argued, while the throne of St. Peter sat empty, a symbol of a church paralyzed by its own internal divisions. The world watched and waited, and a collective desperation began to set in. It was in this atmosphere of spiritual crisis that a letter arrived, a missive that would change everything. The author was not a powerful cardinal or a king, but an 84-year-old hermit living in a remote mountain cave. Pietro da Moron was a man famous for his extreme piety and his founding of a small, austere monastic order. His letter was a fiery prophecy, a warning from God himself that a terrible divine wrath would fall upon the Church if the cardinals did not immediately elect a pope. The letter struck a chord, breaking the political stalemate not with a new argument, but with a blast of perceived holy authority. Can you imagine the pressure these weary cardinals felt, confronted not by an angry mob, but by what they believed was the voice of God speaking through a living saint? In a moment of collective inspiration, or perhaps sheer exhaustion, they made a stunning decision. They would elect the hermit himself. A delegation climbed the mountain to Pietro's cave and informed the astonished old man that he was now Pope Celestine V. This was not an election, it was an abduction of a soul from its chosen solitude. The man who had sought God in silence and poverty was suddenly thrust onto the most powerful throne in Europe. He was utterly unprepared, a holy innocent surrounded by wolves. He knew nothing of administration, diplomacy, or the brutal politics of the papal court. He attempted to rule by creating new cardinals, but he appointed fellow hermits and spiritual seekers who were just as bewildered by the machinery of power as he was. The papal court descended into chaos, a circus of well-meaning but incompetent piety. Real power quickly flowed to King Charles II of Naples, who housed the Pope and effectively became the puppet master of the Vatican. Celestine was a prisoner in a gilded cage, miserable, overwhelmed, and deeply aware that he was failing the church he loved. He saw the corruption swirling around him and knew he was too weak to stop it. Then came the whisper in his ear, the voice of a cunning and ambitious cardinal named Benedetto Cittoni. Cittoni saw the chaos as his opportunity. He is widely believed to have counseled the despairing pope that there was, in fact, an honorable way out, a precedent that would allow a pope to resign his office for the good of the church. Was this divine counsel or a devilish manipulation? After only 5 months of a disastrous pontificate, Celestine V made a decision that shook the foundations of Christendom. He issued a formal decree declaring that a pope could voluntarily abdicate, and then he did exactly that. He stripped off the papal vestments, the symbols of a power he never wanted, and walked away. The cardinals, relieved to be free of the experiment, moved with swift and ruthless efficiency. They elected the very man who had likely engineered the resignation, Cardinal Cittoni, who became Pope Boniface VIII. Boniface immediately set about erasing his predecessor's legacy. He had the former pope arrested, fearing he would become a rallying point for dissent. Celestine died in captivity less than a year later, his brief papacy a tragic parenthesis in history. His resignation was an act of profound humility, but it was also a weapon used by a master of ambition. What does it mean when the only holy act left for a pope is to surrender the power he was given? The resignation of Celestine V stands as one of the most poignant and troubling moments in the history of the papacy, a stark reminder that holiness alone is no match for the ruthless calculus of power. Boniface VIII's arrogance had forged his own downfall. He died just weeks after his shocking humiliation at the hands of French mercenaries in the town of Anagni, a broken man. The event, known to history as the outrage of Anagni, was a seismic shock. A French chancellor had physically assaulted the Pope, slapping him with a gauntlet and holding him prisoner for 3 days, an act previously unimaginable. The message was chillingly clear: even a pope was not beyond the reach of a vengeful king. Into this vacuum of power and prestige stepped the cardinals, who now had to elect a successor under the menacing shadow of the French crown. Their choice was a deliberate attempt at peace. They elected the gentle and conciliatory Niccolò Boccassini, who became Pope Benedict XI. His very election was an apology, a signal to the French king that the Church sought to de-escalate the conflict Boniface had ignited. But how do you lead an institution that has just been publicly slapped in the face? Benedict faced an impossible balancing act. On one hand, he had to uphold the dignity of the papacy and condemn the violent attack on his predecessor. On the other, he needed to appease the terrifying power of France to prevent a total schism. He tried to walk this razor's edge. He first excommunicated the Italian mayor who had helped the French forces, a symbolic act of defiance. But when it came to punishing the French chancellor who had actually struck Boniface, he hesitated, then offered absolution. This was not seen as wise diplomacy by many, but as cowardice. The papacy seemed to be backing down, trading principle for a fragile peace. Then, just 9 months into his pontificate, the situation grew even more mysterious. After dining with a visiting dignitary, Pope Benedict XI was suddenly taken violently ill and died. The rumors spread like wildfire, poisoning the already tense atmosphere. Had his food been tampered with? Was this a convenient assassination, removing a pope who was either too weak or on the verge of becoming too strong for French interests? An official inquiry was opened, but it found no proof of foul play, attributing his death to natural causes. Yet the timing was too perfect, the circumstances too convenient for those who wanted a more pliable pope. His death was not just a biological event, it was a political one. The gentle Benedict, elected to heal a wound, may have been its final victim. What does it mean when the quest for peace itself becomes a death sentence? His brief reign proved that in the aftermath of such a profound humiliation, even a pope chosen for his peacemaking could find no safe path forward. The throne of St. Peter was no longer a seat of unquestioned authority, but a dangerous prize in a game of kings. The death of Benedict XI left the cardinals facing an impossible choice under the unblinking eye of the French king. They gathered in Perugia, but their decision was made for them before a single vote was cast. King Philip IV of France, the very man whose agents had assaulted Boniface, would not tolerate another independent pope. The conclave of 1305 was less an election and more a capitulation. After nearly a year of deadlock and intense royal pressure, the cardinals finally selected a man they knew would be obedient, the French Archbishop of Bordeaux, Bertrand de Got, who became Pope Clement V. He was crowned not in Rome but in Lyon, with King Philip himself holding the bridle of the new pope's horse in a powerful public display of who was truly in control. Clement V would go on to do something no pope before him had ever done. He never once set foot in Rome. The Eternal City, with its ancient traditions and volatile politics, was deemed too dangerous, too distant from the seat of French power. Instead, he settled in the city of Avignon, on the banks of the Rhône River in what is now southern France. This was not a temporary retreat. It was the beginning of a 70-year exile that will be remembered as the Avignon papacy. Can you grasp the significance of this shift? The spiritual center of Western Christendom, the throne of St. Peter, was physically ripped from Italy and replanted on foreign soil, becoming a virtual satellite of the French monarchy. The popes who followed Clement all built and expanded a magnificent palace fortress in Avignon, a symbol of their new permanence and their deep entanglement with French interests. The papacy was now a French institution, its cardinals overwhelmingly French, its policies carefully aligned with the ambitions of the French crown. What does it mean for the leader of a universal faith to become the neighbor and dependent of a single king? For nearly 7 decades, Rome was left to crumble, a ghost of its former glory, while the papacy lived in luxurious exile. The move to Avignon shattered the illusion of papal independence, proving that even after centuries of struggle, the power of a national monarchy could reach out and pull the Church itself across a border. How many millions of the faithful looked toward Avignon and wondered if their spiritual father was now merely a prisoner in a gilded French cage? The Avignon papacy had become a comfortable exile, but its very stability bred a new kind of chaos. When Pope Clement V died in 1314, the cardinals gathered in Carpentras, a town deep in French territory, expecting a swift election. Instead, they plunged the Church into a 2-year void, one of the longest and most brutal conclaves in history. The deadlock was not over theology, but over pure, unadulterated power. The College of Cardinals was split into 3 ferociously opposed factions, 2 Italian and 1 French, each one vetoing the other's candidates with bitter determination. The atmosphere grew so toxic that it erupted into literal violence. A mob of armed men, likely hired by one of the Italian factions, stormed the conclave, looting the palace and setting parts of the town on fire. The cardinals themselves were forced to flee for their lives, scattering to the winds and suspending the election indefinitely. For year after agonizing year, the throne of St. Peter stood empty, a symbol of a church tearing itself apart from the inside. How could the princes of the Church allow their own selfish interests to paralyze the entire body of the faithful for so long? The political pressure from outside became unbearable. Finally, in 1316, after 2 full years of this scandalous vacancy, the cardinals were locked away in a Dominican monastery in Lyon and given an ultimatum by the future King of France. They would not leave until a pope was chosen. Their eventual solution was a compromise that satisfied no one's ambition but everyone's exhaustion. They elected a 72-year-old French cardinal who was not even a priest, Jacques Douze, who became Pope John XXII. He was seen as a stopgap, a feeble old man who would not reign long enough to threaten the delicate balance of power. But the cardinals had made a catastrophic miscalculation. John XXII was not a gentle sunset, he was a political hurricane. This elderly, supposedly temporary pope would go on to rule for 18 years, one of the longest pontificates of the medieval era, and he did so with an iron fist from his palace in Avignon. He was a brilliant administrator and a ruthless financier, centralizing the Church's vast wealth and taxing the clergy with an efficiency that bordered on avarice. He did not see the papacy as a spiritual retreat, but as a corporation to be managed and a court to be commanded. He even plunged the Church into a new theological controversy by publicly preaching that the souls of the saved did not see God until the final judgment, a view that horrified many and was later condemned as heresy. The man elected for his weakness proved to be a titan of control, tightening the French grip on the papacy and proving that the longest waits could sometimes produce the most unexpected and formidable rulers. What does it say about an election when the safest choice turns out to be the most dangerous one of all? The long exile in Avignon had created a deep, festering wound in the soul of the Church. For decades, the popes had ruled from their French palace, a comfortable captivity that many saw as a betrayal of St. Peter's legacy. The city of Rome decayed, its churches falling into ruin and its people feeling abandoned. This growing discontent found a powerful voice in a visionary Swedish noblewoman, Saint Bridget. From her cloister, she wrote fiery letters to the papal court, delivering prophecies and warnings that God's wrath would fall upon them if they did not return the papacy to its rightful home. Her words were not gentle suggestions, they were divine ultimatums that echoed across Europe, turning the political problem of the Avignon papacy into a profound spiritual crisis. Into this storm of expectation stepped the cardinals in 1362, tasked with electing a new pope who could somehow navigate these impossible demands. They chose a man who seemed to be the answer to everyone's prayers, the Benedictine monk Guillaume de Grimoald, who became Pope Urban V. He was a scholar and an ascetic, a man known for his personal holiness and his simple black monk's robe, a stark contrast to the luxurious reds and purples of the Avignon court. He was elected precisely because he was not a career politician, but a pious compromise who might finally have the courage to do what his predecessors would not. Could a man of pure spirit resist the immense gravitational pull of French royal power? For years, Urban hesitated, trapped between the practical comforts and political realities of Avignon and the desperate, holy pleas from Rome. The pressure from Saint Bridget and other mystics intensified, their letters becoming more urgent, their prophecies of doom more vivid. Finally, in 1367, after years of internal struggle, Urban V made a momentous decision. He would sail to Italy. The journey was hailed as a miracle, a triumph of faith over politics. He entered Rome to wild jubilation, a returning father greeted by his long-lost children. The ancient city stirred back to life, its hope restored, but the victory was tragically short-lived. The political situation in Italy was unstable and violent, and the French cardinals in his court were miserable, constantly pressuring him to return to the safety of Avignon. After just 3 years, his resolve broke. He abandoned Rome, sailing back to France in 1370, a decision that crushed the hopes of millions. Saint Bridget had warned him that leaving Rome would mean his death, and her prophecy proved chillingly accurate. Urban V died in Avignon just months after his return, his great experiment in faith ending in failure. His election and his brief return to Rome revealed a painful truth. Even the most pious pope, chosen for his virtue, could be broken by the political machinery that surrounded him. The throne of St. Peter required more than just holiness. It demanded a will of iron, a quality that gentle Urban ultimately lacked. How many second chances does an institution get before its failures become permanent? Urban V's failed return to Rome was a devastating blow to the Church's hopes for unity. The cardinals, still entrenched in Avignon, now faced the immense pressure of electing a successor who could somehow resolve the crisis their French captivity had created. Their choice in 1370 fell upon Pierre Roger de Beaufort, a nephew of Pope Clement VI, who became Gregory XI. He was a young man, just 42 years old, and though deeply tied to the French court and its comforts, he possessed a conscience that would prove to be his undoing. While he settled into the luxurious rhythms of the Avignon palace, a very different force was gathering in Italy, one that would not rely on political maneuvering but on the sheer power of divine conviction. Her name was Catherine of Siena, a Dominican tertiary from a humble background, who experienced vivid visions and bore the stigmata. She was utterly fearless, a woman who believed God spoke directly to her, and she began a relentless campaign of letters to Pope Gregory. Her words were not polite requests, they were fiery commands from God himself. She called Avignon a Babylon of corruption, and the popes continued stay there a poison infecting the entire church. She did not flatter him. She accused him of cowardice, of valuing his own safety over the salvation of the souls entrusted to him. Can you envision the scene, the young pope in his gilded hall, reading these scorching missives from a mystic he had never met, each one chipping away at his resolve? The political arguments for staying in Avignon were overwhelming, but Catherine's spiritual assault was even more powerful. She bypassed politics entirely, appealing directly to his duty to God. The pressure mounted from all sides. In Rome, the situation grew so desperate that the people actually rose in a popular revolt, demanding the return of their pope. The entire Italian peninsula was on the verge of breaking away from a church it saw as hopelessly foreign. Finally, in 1376, Gregory XI made his fateful decision. He would sail for Italy. The journey was perilous and he fell seriously ill almost immediately upon landing, but he pressed on, reaching Rome in early 1377. The return of the papacy after 70 years was met with euphoria. It seemed Catherine of Siena's impossible mission had succeeded, but her victory contained the seeds of an even greater disaster. Gregory XI was a French pope in a hostile Italian city. surrounded by cardinals who despised their new home and longed for Avignon. He died just over a year after his return, and the subsequent conclave in Rome was held under the threat of a murderous Roman mob screaming for an Italian pope. Terrified, the cardinals hastily elected Urban VI, an Italian. Yet almost immediately they came to regret their choice. Urban proved to be a zealous and brutal reformer who openly insulted the cardinals and threatened to dismantle their privileged lifestyles. Claiming they had elected him under duress, the majority of the French cardinals fled Rome, declared Urban's election invalid, and held a new conclave where they elected one of their own, Clement VII, who promptly returned to Avignon. In one swift, tragic stroke, the church was now split in two, with two popes, two curias, and two sets of cardinals, each excommunicating the other. Gregory XI's obedience to a saint's vision had not healed the church, it had shattered it in half. What is the price of answering a divine call if the result is earthly chaos? The return to Rome, achieved through such profound faith, had unleashed the 40-year nightmare of the Western Schism. The Roman mob outside the conclave was not a crowd, it was a weapon. Their chants for an Italian pope were not requests, they were threats that shook the very walls of the Vatican palace. The cardinals inside, most of them French and utterly terrified of the violence brewing just beyond their doors, felt they had only one choice. They hastily elected the Archbishop of Bari, Bartolomeo Prignano, a man they believed was a safe compromise. He was Italian, which would appease the mob, but he was also a known bureaucrat from the old Avignon court, a man they assumed would be reasonable, malleable even. They crowned him Pope Urban VI. The mob dispersed, satisfied, and the cardinals breathed a sigh of relief, believing the crisis had passed. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The man they elected to be a puppet immediately seized the strings for himself. Urban VI was a zealot, convinced that the entire church, and especially the College of Cardinals, was rotten with French luxury and corruption. He launched into a brutal campaign of reform, publicly humiliating the cardinals, screaming at them during consistories, and threatening to strip them of their wealth and appoint new, more pious princes of the church. He did not seek to lead them, he sought to break them. The very men who had elected him now looked at each other in horror. What had they done? They had placed a tyrant on the throne of St. Peter to escape an angry crowd, only to find the man inside the palace was far more dangerous. How quickly does fear turn a political calculation into a historic blunder? Just 5 months after the election, the French cardinals made a stunning declaration. They claimed that Urban's election was invalid, performed under duress and the threat of murder by the Roman mob. They argued they had not been free to vote their conscience, and therefore the entire process was a sham. Abandoning Rome, they fled to the city of Fondi and convened a new conclave. There, with a sense of grim necessity, they elected one of their own, Cardinal Robert of Geneva, a man known for his ruthless suppression of a rebellion in Cesena, where his troops had massacred thousands. He took the name Clement VII. The schism was now official. 2 men each claimed to be the one true vicar of Christ. Urban VI held Rome with a grip of iron, while Clement VII, finding no safe foothold in Italy, sailed back to the familiar comfort and security of Avignon. Europe was now forced to choose sides. France, Scotland, and Spain rallied behind the Avignon Pope Clement. Most of the Holy Roman Empire, England, and much of Italy remained loyal to the Roman Pope Urban. This was not a theological split, it was a political fracture that divided nations, alliances, and the very soul of Christendom. For 39 years, this wound would remain open, with 2 popes, 2 curias, and 2 sets of cardinals, each excommunicating the other and condemning the other's followers to hell. The faithful were left in a state of spiritual agony, never knowing which pope offered true salvation. The desperate election made under the threat of a Roman mob had not averted a crisis, it had spawned a monster that would haunt the church for a generation. What is the true cost of an election held at knife point? For 39 years, the faithful had lived with two suns in their spiritual sky, each one claiming to be the only true light. The Church was tearing itself apart, not over doctrine, but over the simple, agonizing question of who its father was. The rival lines of popes in Rome and Avignon had become entrenched, passing their claims down like bitter family heirlooms. Gregory XII held the Roman line, while Benedict XIII defiantly ruled from Avignon. Neither man would budge, each trusting that time and political alliances would eventually grant him victory. The cost of their stubbornness was a church bleeding credibility and a population losing faith. How long can an institution survive when its very foundation is a lie agreed upon by two different sets of people? Desperation finally pushed the cardinals themselves to act. In a move without precedent, cardinals from both obediences abandoned their respective popes. They issued a joint call for a general council to be held in the Italian city of Pisa in 1409. Their argument was radical. They claimed that a council representing the entire church held authority even above a pope. This was their last, best hope to end the madness. The Council of Pisa was a monumental gathering, a sea of princes, bishops, and theologians all united by a single goal: to heal the schism. The atmosphere was electric with the possibility of peace. The council summoned the two rival popes, Gregory and Benedict, to appear before them and answer for their roles in perpetuating the division. Both men refused, clinging to their thrones from a distance. The council, seeing this as the ultimate act of disobedience, proceeded with a trial in absentia. They heard testimony, reviewed evidence, and reached a verdict that was meant to be definitive. They declared both popes guilty of heresy and schism, and they formally deposed them both. In one sweeping judicial act, the council had declared the papal throne vacant. The cardinals present, a mix from both former factions, then moved to the next phase. They would elect a new, universally accepted pope. The man they chose was the Greek-born Cardinal Peter of Candia, who took the name Alexander V. The bells of Pisa rang out in celebration. The long nightmare, it seemed, was finally over. But the celebration was a mirage. The council had made a fatal miscalculation. It had assumed that by declaring the two existing popes deposed, they would simply fade away. They did not. Gregory XII in Rome and Benedict XIII in Avignon both utterly refused to accept the council's authority. They denounced the entire proceeding as illegal and excommunicated everyone involved. In their eyes, they were still the true popes, so now, instead of two men claiming to be pope, there were three. Alexander V, the Pisan Pope, was now a third contender in a fight that had just become infinitely more complex and absurd. Can you comprehend the sheer chaos of this outcome? The solution had become a worse version of the problem. The Council of Pisa, designed as an act of healing, had performed a surgery that left the patient with three heads. The faithful were now presented with a trilemma of damnation. Following the wrong pope could mean eternal peril. Trust in the institution of the papacy evaporated, not because of a lack of faith in God, but because of a complete collapse of its human leadership. What do you do when the cure for division only creates more factions? The well-intentioned cardinals at Pisa had gambled everything on a unified solution and had instead created a holy trinity of rivals, proving that sometimes the road to chaos is paved with good intentions. The three-headed monster of the papacy seemed incurable. For years, the faithful endured the impossible choice between the popes of Rome, Avignon, and Pisa, each one cursing the other and leaving souls in a state of perpetual spiritual anxiety. The Council of Pisa had tried to solve the problem and had only made it worse. From this utter desperation, a new and far more powerful council was born. In 1414, the greatest gathering of the medieval church convened in the German city of Constance. Its mandate was audacious and absolute: to end the schism, no matter the cost. This was not a meeting of subtle diplomacy, it was a legislative avalanche. the council declared its supreme authority in a groundbreaking decree known as Hic Sancta, stating that a general council representing the entire church held its power directly from Christ and was therefore superior to any pope, even to all three of them at once. Can you grasp the revolutionary nature of that claim? The council was essentially putting the papacy itself on trial, asserting that the institution could save itself only by temporarily suspending the power of the man who led it. The process was methodical and relentless. First, the Pisan Pope John XXIII, who had succeeded Alexander V, was summoned. Seeing the writing on the wall, he initially promised to abdicate, but then he attempted a desperate escape from Constance, disguised as a common stable hand. He was captured, brought back in disgrace, and formally deposed by the council. Next, the Roman Pope Gregory XII faced a choice between dignity and oblivion. In a carefully orchestrated act of sacrifice, he agreed to a conditional resignation. He formally convoked the Council of Constance himself, thereby legitimizing it with his last official act, and then he voluntarily resigned. This graceful exit allowed the Roman line to end not with a deposition, but with a final, dignified surrender that left only one man, the Avignon Pope Benedict XIII. Holed up in his fortress palace in Pensacola, Spain, he refused all pleas, all threats, and all logic. He was the last true believer in his own cause, a papal dinosaur who would not bend. The council finally gave up on him, declaring him a stubborn schismatic and deposing him in absentia. His support evaporated, and he died a few years later, a lonely, defiant relic of a broken system. With all three claimants finally removed from the board, the throne of St. Peter was at last and truly empty. The council then faced its greatest task, electing a single pope whom all of Christendom could follow. To ensure utter fairness, the cardinals were joined by 30 additional delegates from the council's nations, creating an electoral college of 53 men. After 3 days of deliberation, their choice fell upon a Roman cardinal from the powerful Colonna family, Otto Colonna, who became Pope Martin V. The news was met with an explosion of joy and relief that swept across Europe. The 40-year nightmare was over. A single pope sat on the throne of St. Peter. But this hard-won unity came with a profound and lasting cost. The Council of Constance had saved the papacy by temporarily dismantling it, proving that the Church could survive its own leader, but would it ever be truly the same again? The gilded cage of the papacy was now a prize to be purchased by the highest bidder. After the painful reunification at Constance, the office had regained its singular authority, but the political infighting of the Renaissance had twisted the sacred conclave into a marketplace of souls. No single election would ever demonstrate this corruption more brazenly than the one in August of 1492. The death of Pope Innocent VIII left the Church teetering on the edge of a new era, and a master of its darkest arts was waiting in the wings. His name was Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a man of immense wealth, voracious ambition, and a lifetime of experience in the cynical mechanics of Vatican politics. He understood that the throne of St. Peter was not won through prayer, but through a calculated investment in the sins of his peers. The conclave became a public auction, a spectacle of simony where spiritual destiny was bartered for gold and promises. Borgia did not merely lobby his fellow cardinals, he targeted their greed with surgical precision. To one cardinal, he offered the fortress castle of Nepi with all its lands and incomes. To another, he pledged 4 mule loads of silver. He secured the vote of a powerful young cardinal, Ascanio Sforza, with an irresistible package: the lucrative office of vice-chancellor, the Sforza family palace in Rome, and the entire treasury of the papal fortress. Can you conceive of the sheer, naked audacity of buying the leadership of the global church with what amounted to a corporate merger? The final tally was not a reflection of divine will, but of human avarice. Rodrigo Borgia emerged victorious, purchasing the papacy for a fortune in cash, property, and ecclesiastical titles. He took the name Alexander VI. His reign would become a byword for nepotism, ruthless power, and the transformation of the Vatican into a personal court dedicated to the glory of the Borgia name. His children, most famously Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, were placed in positions of immense secular and religious power, their lives a swirl of political marriages and whispered scandals. The election of 1492 proved that the most dangerous threat to the papacy was no longer an external emperor or a rival antipope, but the internal rot of an institution that had learned to sell its own soul. What happens when the guardians of faith become its greatest auctioneers? The corruption of the Borgia papacy had left Rome gasping for air, desperate for a leader who could cleanse the stench of simony and restore its tarnished honor. The death of Pope Pius III, who had reigned for just 26 days after Alexander VI, created a power vacuum that two formidable rivals were poised to fill. On one side stood the French candidate, Cardinal Georges d'Amboise, backed by the might of a foreign king. On the other was Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, a man whose entire life had been a relentless march toward the papal throne. He was the bitter enemy of the Borgias, a cardinal for over 30 years, and he understood that this was his final chance. The conclave of 1503 was not a quiet prayer, it was a political battlefield, and Giuliano fought with every weapon he possessed. He deployed a masterful campaign of promises and intimidation, swearing to cardinals that he would not reign long and secretly guaranteeing them lucrative positions in his future court. But his most powerful argument was not a bribe, it was a specter he himself raised, the terrifying fear of a Borgia restoration. Cesare Borgia, the Pope's ruthless son, still commanded an army and was maneuvering to influence the election from his sick. Giuliano della Rovere presented himself as the only bulwark against the return of that corrupt dynasty, the one man strong enough to keep the Borgias from reclaiming the throne they had bought. The cardinals, terrified of that dark alternative, fell in line. In the shortest conclave in history, lasting just a few hours, they elected Giuliano della Rovere as Pope Julius II. The man who had fought so hard to win the papacy through politics would now rule it as a warrior. He did not see himself as a spiritual shepherd, but as a commander-in-chief, a new Caesar whose divine mission was to reclaim the papal states through military conquest. He led armies in person, wearing silver armor and charging into the thick of battle, earning him the nickname Il Papa Terribile, the fearsome Pope. Can you envision the leader of the Catholic Church not in robes, but in the polished steel of a general surveying a battlefield? Yet this same terrifying will to power also fueled one of the most breathtaking artistic explosions the world has ever seen. The same man who waged war to secure the Church's earthly kingdom also commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and summoned Raphael to decorate his personal apartments. He laid the foundation stone for the new St. Peter's Basilica, a project of staggering ambition meant to cement the Church's glory for millennia. His pontificate was a paradox of brutal force and sublime beauty, all driven by an iron will that would not be denied. How does one man contain the capacity for both the battlefield and the masterpiece? Julius II proved that the quest for power could be channeled into creation as well as destruction, leaving a legacy where the echoes of cannon fire are forever intertwined with the silent awe of a painted ceiling. The warrior Pope Julius II had reshaped Rome with steel and art, but his death in 1513 left behind a throne that was now the ultimate prize in Italian politics. The cardinals did not seek another general, they sought a patron, a man who could transform the Vatican into the most brilliant court of the Renaissance. Their gaze fell upon a young cardinal who embodied that ideal, Giovanni de' Medici. He was not just another prince of the Church, he was the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, raised from childhood to believe that power and beauty were intertwined. The conclave that elected him was a foregone conclusion, a seamless transfer of authority to the most powerful and cultured family in Florence. At just 37 years old and still not ordained as a priest, Giovanni was elected Pope Leo X. His reported exclamation upon his election has echoed through history as the very symbol of Renaissance excess. He is said to have written to his brother, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." And enjoy it he did. Can you picture the scene? The Vatican was no longer a center of piety or a military headquarters. It became a stage for unparalleled extravagance. Pope Leo was a tremendous patron of the arts, funding Raphael's greatest works and filling the papal libraries with priceless manuscripts. But his court was also a vortex of consumption, with banquets featuring roasted peacocks, jesters, and plays that cost more than some nations' annual treasuries. He spent the vast wealth accumulated by his frugal predecessor in a matter of months, draining the papal coffers to fund a perpetual festival. This was not a spiritual leadership, it was a cultural dictatorship where the church itself became the primary sponsor of secular splendor. How do you separate the glory of art from the sin of vanity when both are funded from the same sacred treasury? The papacy was now a vehicle for family prestige and personal pleasure, a symbol of a church so confident in its earthly power that it had begun to forget its heavenly mission. The election of Leo X proved that the greatest threat to the papacy was no longer an external enemy, but the internal seduction of its own immense wealth and cultural influence. What is the ultimate cost when the pursuit of beauty bankrupts the soul of an institution? Leo X's extravagant reign bled the papacy dry, both financially and spiritually, leaving his successor a poisoned chalice. The cardinals, still enmeshed in Medici politics, turned to his cousin, Giulio de' Medici, who became Pope Clement VII in 1523. He was a capable administrator, but he inherited a world cracking apart. Across the Alps, the Protestant Reformation, ignited by Martin Luther, was burning through the faith of millions, challenging the very foundations of the Catholic Church. Clement faced a geopolitical nightmare, trapped between two colossi, the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. His papacy became a masterclass in disastrous hesitation. He switched alliances, first siding with France against the emperor, then betraying the French to make a separate peace. This political betrayal was his undoing. Emperor Charles V's massive army, filled with unpaid German Lutheran mercenaries and Spanish troops, was already in Italy. When their pay did not arrive, this mutinous multinational force, hungry and filled with contempt for the papacy, turned its rage on the very heart of Christendom. In May of 1527, they descended upon an almost defenseless Rome. The city's walls were breached, and for 9 months a nightmare unfolded. The sack of Rome was not a battle, it was an orgy of destruction. Lutheran soldiers desecrated churches, tombs, and relics, mocking the pope they saw as the Antichrist. Swiss guards were massacred at the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. Nuns were violated, citizens were tortured for ransom, and palaces were stripped of their artistic treasures. Pope Clement himself became a prisoner in the fortified Castel Sant'Angelo, watching helplessly as smoke and screams rose over his city. He eventually escaped disguised as a commoner, a broken man. The message was terrifyingly clear. The Pope was no longer untouchable. He could be defied, besieged, and humiliated not by a rival antipope but by a rogue army. The spiritual capital of Europe had been ravaged, and with it the last vestiges of papal moral authority. How could the Vicar of Christ command respect when he could not even protect his own city? The election of Clement VII, meant to continue a dynasty of splendor, had instead delivered the papacy to its most profound humiliation since the days of Anagni, proving that in the new world of gunpowder and reformation, indecision was a fate worse than corruption. The humiliation of the sack of Rome had left the papacy spiritually and politically bankrupt. Clement VII's disastrous reign ended with the Church facing its greatest existential threat since the Great Schism, the relentless spread of the Protestant Reformation. The cardinals who gathered in 1534 knew they could not afford another weak or indecisive pope, nor could they risk another political firebrand. Their solution was a paradox. They elected a man who embodied the very corruption the reformers railed against, in the desperate hope that he could save the institution from itself. That man was Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, who took the name Pope Paul III. He was 76 years old, a worldly Renaissance prince known for his lavish patronage of the arts and his shameless nepotism, having made his teenage grandsons cardinals. Yet he was also a shrewd political realist who understood that the Church was bleeding souls by the day. His election was a calculated gamble, a compromise between the old guard who wanted business as usual and the growing reformist faction who saw the coming apocalypse. Could a man who had profited so handsomely from the system possibly be the one to reform it? Paul III answered that question with a series of stunning, decisive actions. He began by appointing to the College of Cardinals a new breed of churchmen, pious intellectuals and dedicated reformers like Reginald Pole and Giovanni Pietro Caraffa, who would become the architects of the Catholic response. Then, in 1545, after years of complex diplomacy, he achieved what his predecessors could not. He officially convened the Council of Trent. This was the moment the Counter-Reformation truly began. The council would take 18 years, meeting in fits and starts, but its decrees would define Catholicism for centuries, reaffirming core doctrines while mandating a sweeping internal cleanup of clerical corruption and ignorance. The paradox of Paul III is one of history's great puzzles. He was a pope who enriched his family with one hand while setting in motion the Church's spiritual renewal with the other. His election proved that sometimes the only person who can fix a broken system is the one who knows all its flaws from the inside, a man who loved the Church's grandeur enough to risk changing it forever. What does it mean for salvation to arrive not from a saint, but from a savvy political operator who finally saw the abyss ahead? The great reforms of Trent demanded a leader of pure and unwavering character, a pope who could embody the renewal the Church so desperately needed. In April 1555, the cardinals believed they had found their perfect candidate in Marcello Cervini. He was a man of impeccable integrity, a scholar and a dedicated reformer who had served as one of the presidents of the Council of Trent. His election was a moment of genuine hope, a collective sigh of relief from those who longed for a pontiff free from the taint of nepotism and worldly ambition. He took the name Marcellus II, and he immediately began as he meant to go on. He refused the elaborate coronation ceremony, declaring such pageantry unbefitting a church that needed humility above all else. He forbade his relatives from coming to Rome to seek favors, breaking a centuries-old tradition of papal families enriching themselves. For 22 days, it seemed a new dawn had finally arrived. Then, with shocking suddenness, the light was extinguished. Pope Marcellus II was dead. The official cause was listed as a stroke, but the timing was so convenient for his enemies that whispers of poison slithered through the corridors of the Vatican. Could his rigorous reform agenda have threatened the powerful cardinals and courtiers who profited from the old ways? A pope who lived simply and ruled justly was a dangerous thing to a system built on privilege. His brief reign became a haunting what if in the history of the papacy, a flicker of purity snuffed out before it could become a flame. What might the Church have become if a man of such principle had been given years instead of days? The mystery of his death serves as a solemn reminder that in the struggle for the soul of an institution, the forces of the status quo can sometimes strike with silent, brutal efficiency. The brief, hopeful reign of Marcellus II was over, and the cardinals now faced a stark choice. Would they retreat from the path of reform, or would they charge down it with a vengeful fury? Their answer came in the form of Gian Pietro Caraffa, an elderly cardinal whose entire life had been a preparation for holy war. He was the co-founder of the Theatine Order, a group dedicated to clerical reform, and for the past 8 years he had served as the terrifying head of the Roman Inquisition. This was not a diplomat or a politician. This was a zealot who saw compromise as a sin. His election as Pope Paul IV in 1555 was not a continuation of reform, it was a declaration of it. The Counter-Reformation now had its most ruthless general. Can you feel the shift in the atmosphere of Rome? The city, which had begun to breathe under the gentle Marcellus, now held its breath. Paul IV saw heresy not just in the Protestant north, but lurking in every shadow of Italy, even within the Vatican itself. His first act was to unleash the Inquisition with a ferocity never seen before. He established a ghetto for Rome's Jewish population, forcing them to live in a segregated quarter and wear identifying yellow hats, a brutal policy of isolation and humiliation. His Index of Forbidden Books was a breathtaking act of intellectual control, banning thousands of texts deemed dangerous, including the complete works of Erasmus, one of the most celebrated humanist thinkers of the age. The papal jails began to fill with those accused of unorthodox beliefs, and the smoke from the fires of burned books and sometimes even people stained the Roman sky. This was a pope so suspicious of Spanish influence that he went to war with the Habsburg Empire, a conflict that ended in a humiliating defeat for the papacy. His own nepotism was legendary. He elevated his own nephews to the cardinalate with a blind favoritism that shocked even his supporters, only to turn on them violently when they failed to meet his impossible standards. One nephew died in prison, another fled for his life. The man elected to purify the church ruled through a toxic combination of paranoia and an unshakable belief in his own righteousness. What does it mean when the quest for purity becomes its own form of tyranny? The election of Paul IV proved that the fire of reform could burn just as destructively as the corruption it sought to cleanse, leaving a legacy of fear that would long outlive the old pope's furious reign. The furious reign of Paul IV left Rome trembling, and his death in 1559 created a vacuum of fear and opportunity. The cardinals who gathered that summer were not just choosing a new pope, they were deciding the very future of the Counter-Reformation itself. Would they continue the path of fire and inquisition, or would they seek a different way? The conclave that followed plunged them into a 4-month nightmare of political deadlock, one of the longest and most difficult of the entire 16th century. The College of Cardinals was split into 2 irreconcilable camps, each backed by a foreign power. On one side stood the French faction, determined to place a pope on the throne who would check the growing influence of the Spanish and Habsburg empires. On the other stood the imperial faction, loyal to King Philip II of Spain, who demanded a pope firmly committed to the Spanish vision of Catholic orthodoxy. For 120 agonizing days, these 2 blocs faced each other in the sweltering Roman heat, each one vetoing the other's candidates, each one refusing to yield an inch of ground. The doors of the conclave were sealed, but the political machinations flowed freely in and out through whispered messages and secret pacts. Can you conceive of the frustration, the stifling atmosphere of a sacred duty transformed into a high-stakes diplomatic siege? The Church was leaderless at a critical moment, its great reform council suspended, its enemies watching and waiting for any sign of weakness. The cardinals themselves began to fall ill from the stress and the cramped conditions, their health failing as their resolve hardened. It seemed the conclave might simply collapse without producing a result, leaving the Church adrift. In this atmosphere of utter exhaustion, a compromise finally began to seem possible. The man who emerged was not a fiery zealot or a political ideologue, but a seasoned and patient administrator, Cardinal Giovanni Angelo Medici. He was a crucial distinction. He had no relation to the powerful Florentine Medici dynasty. He was a man from a minor Milanese family, a career diplomat known for his moderation and his ability to navigate between the warring factions. His great skill was that he had made no powerful enemies, and he promised no radical upheaval. To the exhausted cardinals, he was not the ideal candidate. He was the only possible exit from their self-made prison. They elected him as Pope Pius IV, a choice born not of inspiration but of sheer, desperate necessity. His first and most significant act was to prove the wisdom of their compromise. He immediately reconvened the Council of Trent, which had been suspended for a decade. Where Paul IV had ruled with the iron fist of the Inquisition, Pius IV governed with the steady hand of a lawyer and a diplomat. He shepherded the council to its final, successful conclusion in 1563, securing the doctrinal and disciplinary foundations that would define the Catholic Church for the next 4 centuries. The long, bitter conclave had, against all odds, produced the very leader the moment required, a man who could finish the work of reform without the paranoia and purges of his predecessor. What is the true value of a compromise forged in exhaustion? The election of Pius IV demonstrated that sometimes the most effective leader is not the one who shouts the loudest, but the one who can quietly, patiently, and persistently bring a fractured world back together. The compromise of Pius IV had brought the Council of Trent to a close, but its decrees were just words on parchment until a pope arrived to enforce them with an iron will. The conclave of 1566 sought a leader who was the absolute opposite of the diplomatic, pragmatic Pius. They turned to a man whose entire life was a testament to unyielding austerity, Cardinal Michel Ghislery, a Dominican friar who had once been a shepherd and still wore his coarse white monastic habit beneath the robes of a cardinal. He was the living embodiment of the Reformed spirit, a former Grand Inquisitor who had served under the fearsome Paul IV. His election was a calculated move by the reformist cardinals, a way to placate the most zealous faction without appointing another paranoid tyrant. They believed they were getting a saint, but they were also getting a man who saw the world in the starkest terms of good and evil, with no room for political gray areas. Can a man of pure, unbending principle effectively lead a global institution that must navigate the murky waters of international politics? Pope Pius V answered that question with a reign of breathtaking conviction. He immediately implemented the reforms of Trent with a rigor that shocked the Roman Curia. He forced bishops to reside in their dioceses, ended the sale of indulgences, and expelled prostitutes from the city, cleaning up the moral life of Rome with the zeal of a village priest. But his most momentous act was to look beyond Italy to an island kingdom where he saw a mortal threat to the Catholic faith. In England, Queen Elizabeth I had consolidated the Protestant Anglican Church. To Pius, she was not a monarch to be negotiated with. She was a heretic usurper who had illegitimately seized control of the English Church. In 1570, he issued a papal bull that shook the foundations of Europe, Regnans in Excelsis. This document excommunicated Queen Elizabeth and, most critically, released all her Catholic subjects from their allegiance to her. It was an act of spiritual warfare that effectively declared open season on the English Queen, encouraging plots against her life and forcing every English Catholic to choose between their Queen and their Pope. This was not a political maneuver, it was a theological declaration of war from a man who believed he was answerable only to God. The consequences were catastrophic for Catholics in England, who were now viewed as potential traitors in their own land, facing persecution and suspicion for generations. The saintly compromise had produced a pope whose holiness was undeniable, but whose single-minded certainty plunged thousands of his own flock into danger. What is the true cost of a leader who never doubts his own righteousness? The saintly certainty of Pius V had given way to a pope of quiet compromise, but the cardinals of 1585 were tired of weakness. They wanted a leader who could finish the great building projects of Rome and impose order with an unshakable will, yet they remained deeply suspicious of any colleague who openly displayed such ambition. Into this political trap stepped Cardinal Fellis Peretti, a man who understood the brutal theater of the conclave better than anyone. He was a Franciscan of humble origins, known for his sharp mind and relentless energy, but he made a conscious, calculated decision to hide those qualities. Throughout the election process, Peretti played the part of a feeble old man. He leaned heavily on a cane, he feigned a persistent, racking cough, and he spoke in a weak, trembling voice about his desire for a quiet retirement and his failing health. He presented himself as the perfect compromise candidate, a harmless placeholder who would not live long enough to threaten the delicate balance of power among the rival factions. The cardinals, convinced they had found a safe, temporary solution, elected him with a sense of relief. They believed they were crowning a puppet. The moment the final vote was cast, the performance ended. Felix Peretti threw aside his cane, stood to his full height, and declared in a strong, clear voice that he would take the name Sixtus V. The charade was over, and the real man was revealed. Can you envision the shock in that chamber, the sudden, chilling realization that they had been completely and utterly fooled? The frail old cardinal they had elected was an illusion, and in his place stood one of the most formidable administrators in papal history. He moved with the speed of a general, not a convalescent. He immediately set about taming the lawless Roman countryside, authorizing the public execution of bandits with a swiftness that shocked the city. He launched an unprecedented urban renewal project, resurrecting ancient aqueducts to bring fresh water to the city's hills, and he laid out new, straight boulevards to connect the great basilicas, forever changing the map of Rome. His most enduring legacy, however, was the completion of the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, a project that had languished for decades. He drove the architects and workers with an iron will, and he financed it all through a ruthless campaign of taxation and the creation of new government offices that he sold to the highest bidders. The man who had pretended to be weak proved to be a whirlwind of relentless energy, a pope who got things done by any means necessary. His election stands as a masterclass in political deception, a stark lesson that in the quest for the throne of St. Peter, the greatest threat was often not the most obvious candidate, but the one clever enough to hide his true power until the moment the keys were in his hand. What does it say about an election when the only path to victory is a perfect lie? The deceptive energy of Sixtus V had restored order, but the next conclave would test whether that order could survive a deadlock between two superpowers. In 1605, the cardinals gathered under a shadow of international tension, bitterly divided between the French and Spanish factions. For weeks, they were locked in a stalemate, each side vetoing the other's champion with a stubbornness that threatened to reopen the wounds of the past. The solution, when it finally came, was a classic Roman compromise. They turned to a man neither faction truly wanted, but whom both could tolerate, the 52-year-old Cardinal Camillo Borgia. He was elected as Pope Paul V, a choice of pure political exhaustion that instantly elevated his family into the highest echelon of Roman power. The Borgia family had arrived, and they would use the papacy to build a dynasty of breathtaking speed and ambition. Can a pope chosen for his neutrality truly govern without picking a side? Paul V soon found himself in a conflict that tested the very limits of his spiritual authority. The Venetian Republic, a fiercely independent state, had passed laws restricting the Church's power to acquire land and putting clergy under the jurisdiction of secular courts. To Pope Paul, this was an intolerable attack on the liberty of the Church. He responded with the Church's ultimate weapon. He placed the entire Venetian Republic under an interdict. This was a spiritual siege, a decree that forbade priests from performing any sacraments, from baptisms to last rites. The entire population was, in theory, cut off from the path to salvation. But the Venetian Senate, led by the brilliant and determined Doge Leonardo Donna, did not flinch. They simply ordered their priests to ignore the Pope. They argued that the Pope's authority did not extend to the temporal governance of their republic. The interdict failed spectacularly, a spiritual weapon rendered useless by political will. The Venetian people continued to receive the sacraments from defiant priests, and their state stood firm against the united pressure of the papacy and Spain. The conflict was only resolved through French mediation. a humiliating climb down for a pope who had tried to command a sovereign nation with a decree. Then came the scientist. When Galileo Galilei pointed his new telescope to the heavens, he saw evidence that the Earth moved around the Sun, a direct challenge to the Church's Earth-centered view of the universe. In 1616, Paul V's administration summoned Galileo to Rome and ordered the Inquisition to examine the Copernican theory. The result was a condemnation, a formal decree that declared the idea of a moving Earth to be philosophically absurd and formally heretical. Galileo was silenced for a time. This was not the personal vendetta of a pope, but the defensive reaction of an institution that saw its intellectual authority crumbling. Paul V, the compromise candidate, had now challenged both a republic and a new scientific reality, and in both cases he was fighting a rearguard action against a world that was changing faster than the Vatican could comprehend. His pontificate became a monument to the paradox of papal power, a reminder that the man elected to be a neutral peacemaker could often become the catalyst for the very conflicts he sought to avoid. How do you lead a universal church when the world it seeks to govern no longer believes in its universal authority? The compromise of Paul V had left the papacy weakened, its authority challenged by republics and scientists alike. Into this power vacuum stepped a cardinal who understood that the throne of St. Peter was no longer won by divine right, but by the sheer force of money and family ambition. The conclave of 1623 was a masterclass in political investment, and Maffei Barberini was its most eager financier. He spent a staggering 100,000 scudi, a fortune that would be worth millions today, to secure the votes of his fellow cardinals. He did not just campaign, he purchased loyalty with lavish gifts and strategic promises, turning a sacred duty into a high-stakes auction. His victory was a triumph of the Barberini family, and when he took the name Urban VIII, he embarked on one of the most brazenly nepotistic reigns in history. Can you conceive of a papal court transformed into a family business? He immediately elevated two of his nephews to the powerful rank of cardinal, and a third he made the general of the church, placing the family emblem, the bee, on every building and monument he commissioned. The Barberini bees swarmed over Rome, a constant reminder of a dynasty that had bought the papacy and intended to make it their hive. This was not mere favoritism, it was a systemic takeover where the resources of the entire church were funneled into the glorification of a single name. Yet this grand patron of the arts, this man who championed the genius of Bernini and filled the city with breathtaking Baroque splendor, also possessed a deeply paranoid and vengeful streak. His suspicions eventually fell upon the small but strategically vital Duchy of Parma. When a minor border dispute escalated, Urban VIII saw an opportunity to crush a rival and seize territory for his family. He declared war, a decision that shocked all of Europe. This was not a crusade against infidels or a defense of the faith. It was a petty, personal conflict waged by the Pope himself. He poured the Church's treasury into the campaign, funding an army to march against a fellow Catholic state. The War of Castro, as it became known, was a catastrophic failure. The papal forces were humiliated, the treasury was emptied, and the Barberini family was left deeply unpopular. The man who had bought the papacy with gold had nearly bankrupted it with pride. What is the ultimate price of an election where the highest bidder wins? The reign of Urban VIII stands as a glaring monument to the paradox of Renaissance power, where the pursuit of immortal beauty was funded by the most temporal and corrupt of means, and where a pope's personal vendetta could bring the entire institution to the brink of financial and moral ruin. Urban VIII's disastrous war had emptied the papal treasury and left the cardinals deeply wary of another powerful family seizing control. The conclave of 1655 stretched on for 80 agonizing days, a 3-month siege of political wills where no faction could muster enough votes to crown its champion. The French delegation, led by the formidable Cardinal Mazarin, deployed a relentless veto against every candidate proposed by the Spanish faction, creating a stalemate that seemed to have no end. Inside the sealed halls, the air grew thick with frustration and the stench of political decay. How could the Church govern the faithful when its own leaders could not even govern their ambitions? The eventual solution was not a victory, but a surrender to pure exhaustion. The cardinals turned to a man who had built his career not in the corridors of Roman power, but at the negotiating tables of Europe, Fabio Chigi. As a leading papal diplomat at the monumental Peace of Westphalia, he had witnessed firsthand the rising power of nation-states and the diminishing influence of the papacy. He was elected as Pope Alexander VII precisely because he was seen as a neutral, experienced intellectual, a compromise who could heal the bitter divisions. But could a diplomat who had negotiated peace between warring empires manage the simmering tensions within his own court? Alexander's pontificate began with a powerful symbol of this new humility. He arrived for his coronation in a modest hearse, a stark contrast to the lavish processions of his predecessors, signaling a return to simpler values. This gesture, however, was quickly overshadowed by the very forces of nepotism he had promised to avoid. Despite his initial reluctance, he soon summoned his nephew, Flavio Chigi, to Rome and made him a cardinal and his chief advisor, proving that even the most well-intentioned pope could not escape the gravitational pull of family. His greatest challenge, however, came from the young, arrogant King Louis XIV of France. The conflict erupted over a trivial point of protocol, a diplomatic incident in Rome where the Pope's Corsican guards insulted the French ambassador's retinue. Louis XIV, eager to assert his dominance, seized upon the insult as a pretext for a massive power play. He demanded a humiliating apology, and when Alexander hesitated, he invaded the Papal States, capturing the cities of Avignon and the surrounding territory. The spiritual leader of Catholicism was suddenly at the mercy of a temporal king. With no army to speak of and no allies willing to challenge France, Alexander VII was forced to capitulate completely. He was compelled to sign the humiliating Treaty of Pisa in 1664, which required him to erect a pyramid in Rome inscribed with a formal apology to the French crown. The man elected for his diplomatic skills had been outmaneuvered and utterly defeated by a secular monarch. His papacy became a lasting lesson in the New World Order, a clear sign that the sun of papal authority had truly set, and that its light now merely reflected the glory of kings. What remains of spiritual power when it must kneel to a temporal sword? The humiliation of Alexander VII was a wound that never fully healed, a permanent reminder that kings now held the power to dictate terms to the Pope himself. Just 3 decades later, that royal power would be wielded with surgical precision in the conclave of 1691. The Spanish monarch, Charles II, was determined to ensure the next pope would be a political ally, and he possessed a formal, terrifying weapon to enforce his will, the jus exclusivi, the official right of exclusion. This was not a secret bribe or a backroom threat. It was a public, acknowledged veto that allowed a Catholic crown to block any candidate it deemed unacceptable. The conclave dragged on for 5 months, deadlocked between factions, until a leading candidate emerged, Cardinal Gregorio Barbarigo. He was a pious and reform-minded man, exactly the kind of independent spirit the Spanish crown feared. As his support grew, the Spanish ambassador requested and was granted a formal audience with the assembled cardinals. In that sacred space, he did not negotiate, he delivered an ultimatum. In the name of his king, he exercised the jus exclusivi and vetoed Barbarigo's candidacy. The spiritual election was halted by the flat of a secular ruler. Can any authority be considered supreme when an outside power can simply disqualify its leader? With Barbarigo removed, the exhausted cardinals sought a compromise who could satisfy both the need for reform and the demands of Spanish royalty. Their choice fell upon Cardinal Antonio Pignatelli, who became Pope Innocent XII. He was a seasoned diplomat who understood the limits of papal power in this new age, but he was also a man of genuine principle. His response to the corrupt system of nepotism was swift and stunning. He issued a papal bull, Romanum Decet Pontificem, that permanently outlawed the practice. No pope could ever again appoint a relative to the College of Cardinals, and any financial favors to family members were strictly forbidden. He led by example, living a life of notable personal austerity and focusing on charitable works and administrative reform. The man who ascended to the throne because of a royal veto became one of the most effective reformers of the century, proving that sometimes the most constrained beginnings can produce the most principled reigns. But the echo of the Spanish ambassador's voice in the conclave lingered, a haunting question for the modern church. How do you exercise spiritual sovereignty in a world of earthly kings? The new century dawned on a papacy caught between warring empires. As the year 1700 began, the death of Pope Innocent XII plunged the Church into the heart of a looming European catastrophe, the War of the Spanish Succession. France and the Holy Roman Empire were on the brink of war over the vast Spanish Empire, and each needed a pope who would favor their cause. The conclave was not a spiritual retreat, but a diplomatic battlefield, with the ambassadors of kings acting as generals in a war of whispers and vetoes. The cardinals were trapped, pressured to elect a pope who could navigate this impossible situation. Their solution was to choose a man of remarkable intellect and undeniable virtue, but one who lacked a crucial qualification. Cardinal Giovanni Francesco Albani was only 51 years old, and in a break with centuries of tradition, he was not yet a bishop. His election as Pope Clement XI was a calculated risk, a bet that his political neutrality and personal goodness would outweigh his inexperience. The ceremony had to be paused. Before he could be crowned, Giovanni Francesco Albani had to be consecrated as a bishop, a sacred ordination performed under the shadow of international crisis. Can any leader find their spiritual footing when they are rushed to the altar of power? Clement XI was immediately crushed by the weight of the conflict he was chosen to resolve. He desperately tried to maintain the Church's neutrality, but the giants of Europe would not allow it. When he recognized the French candidate for the Spanish throne, the Holy Roman Emperor was so enraged he invaded the Papal States, seizing territory and humiliating the Pope. Clement was forced to reverse his decision, which only angered the French in turn. For years, he was pushed and pulled by forces far beyond his control, his every move scrutinized and punished by one empire or the other. The man elected for his virtue became a pawn in a game of thrones, his authority shredded between the grinding gears of French and Austrian ambition. His long pontificate became a tragic lesson in the limits of good intentions, proving that even the most pure-hearted pope could not stand against the raw, nationalistic interests of the modern world. What is the value of spiritual authority when it can be invaded and silenced by a passing army? The spiritual authority of the papacy had become a ghost of its former self, a whisper against the roaring engines of modern states. In 1775, the cardinals sought not a warrior or a saint, but a man of impeccable taste and political grace, a final flourish of Baroque splendor before the coming storm. Their choice was Giovanni Angelo Braschi, a handsome and cultured aristocrat elected as Pope Pius VI. He was the very image of a Renaissance prince reborn, a patron of the arts who drained the Pontine marshes and expanded the Vatican museums, pouring the Church's dwindling resources into magnificent projects meant to project an undiminished glory. He moved through the halls of the Quirinal Palace with the confidence of a man who believed the old order was eternal. But a revolution was brewing in France that would treat his ancient authority with contemptuous disregard. The French revolutionaries saw the Church not as a spiritual guide, but as a pillar of the hated old regime, a corrupt institution hoarding wealth and power. They confiscated church lands, stripped clerics of their special status, and enacted a civil constitution of the clergy that placed the Church under state control. Pius issued condemnations and agonized over diplomatic responses, but his words were like paper shields against a bayonet charge. In 1796, the revolutionary fervor arrived at his doorstep in the form of a young general, Napoleon Bonaparte. The French army marched into the Papal States, and Pius was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Tolentino, surrendering vast territories, priceless works of art, and immense sums of gold. The Pope had been reduced to a tributary, paying for a peace that would not last. 2 years later, a French general again entered Rome, declared the papal government abolished, and established a new Roman Republic. Then came the ultimate, unimaginable insult. Soldiers stormed the Quirinal Palace. Pius VI, the Vicar of Christ, was arrested at his desk. He was ordered from his palace, a prisoner in his own city, and then marched out of Rome entirely. The world watched in stunned disbelief as the elderly Pope was taken north across the Alps into France. He was moved from one fortified town to another, his health failing with each mile, a spectacle of sacred power brought low by secular might. He died in exile in the city of Valence in 1799, a captive of the French Republic, his body initially buried in a simple, unmarked grave. Can you fathom the symbolic weight of that death? The leader of the Catholic Church, the successor of St. Peter, had not died in Rome, but as a prisoner of a state that had rejected God. His entire pontificate was a tragic arc from glorious patronage to the most profound humiliation, a living prophecy of the end of the papacy's 1,000-year reign as a temporal power. What remains of a pope when his palaces are occupied, his land seized, and his person turned into a political prisoner? The exile of Pius VI was not merely the end of a man, but the death of an idea, a brutal announcement that the sun of papal sovereignty had finally been extinguished by the cold, rational dawn of the modern world. From the trial of a rotting corpse to the election of a prisoner in exile, these 35 dramatic papal elections trace a story far greater than any single pope. The struggle for St. Peter's throne was never just about the men who sat on it. It was about the very soul of an institution torn between heaven and earth. The immense spiritual power of the papacy made its earthly selection a prize worth any sin, a magnet for the rawest human ambitions of greed, family pride, and national glory. For over 1,000 years, this sacred process was hijacked by warlords, manipulated by kings, and even purchased with sacks of gold, each conclave reflecting the brutal political realities of its age. Yet through it all, a fragile thread of faith endured, a stubborn belief that divine will could somehow work through the most flawed and human of systems. This eternal tension between the ideal of a spiritual leader and the reality of his political election is the true drama of the papacy, a battle for the soul of power that reshaped Western civilization itself. We have walked through this shadowed corridor of history, from the Cadaver Synod to the Avignon exile and the humiliations of the modern era. Now we turn the story over to you. Of all these shocking elections, which one stands out in your mind? Was it the resignation of Celestine V, the hermit pope who surrendered his power, or the brazen auction conducted by Rodrigo Borgia? Share which of these dramatic contests shocked you the most in the comments below.